Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, we continue our offseason series breaking down the future of the bullpen, Edwin Diaz and the rest of the internal free agents, external options, and much more. As always, we close out the show answering your mailbag questions. Reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Mets Pod. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And Joe, there is no other way to kick off this show than saying Phillies Astros World Series. I don't think anybody saw the Phillies coming out on top in the National League, but when you're hot, as Mets fans learned in 2015. Joe, I'll keep this one tight and simple, and then we'll get into all the Mets talk. Who are you rooting for in this year's World Series?
Let's go Astros.
Pretty simple. Pretty simple over here. We don't root for division rivals. I will say, you have to give credit where it's due. The Phillies are having fun. The energy is amazing to watch. I'm jealous of it as a baseball fan when you see what's going on over there. But we are, with no shame in it, rooting for the Astros on this podcast. And on this podcast, we have a lot to get through as our offseason series continues. We did the starting rotation last week on a long show, obviously headlined by Jacob deGrom, but the Mets having a ton of spots to fill out on that. There's a lot to go through, and if you haven't listened to it, go check it out. As today we get into the bullpen, which is much of the same, honestly. When you look at it, the rotation, at least there was a few guys you could pencil in, as Joe said, not write in with ink. With the bullpen, this group can look entirely different, Joe, and there is no way, nowhere else for us to start with than the man that was the best closer in baseball this season in Edwin Diaz, your guy. We've been very vocal on this show that we think this is the no-brainer, the one that gets done or needs to get done. So, Joe, I don't really need to ask you stay or go for Edwin Diaz, but more or less, what does a deal look like, and why does it make sense for both sides?
It's a record-setting deal, I think, is the best way to start. I think
Which isn't crazy, by the way, the reliever market.
It's pretty pricey, but it's not, we're not talking $30 million a year by any means, but it wouldn't shock me if Edwin Diaz got to 20 a year. Yep. I believe Liam Hendricks is the leader now. He's making like 18 or 18 and a half a year.
That's right.
So Diaz, to me, it seems pretty straightforward. One, you can't replace him. Two, obviously he was fantastic here. He's embraced New York. The Mets have the marketing opportunities, obviously everything with Narco and just everything surrounding Diaz, and he loves it here. Like, it feels like I could question any other free agent that the Mets have. What they're going to do with deGrom, what they're going to do with Nimmo, and up and down the list. Diaz, to me, just kind of sticks out as, yeah, maybe it won't happen immediately. It would be nice if it did. But to me, I'm looking at 5 years, $100 million, give or take. Set the market, set the new reliever record, and keep Edwin Diaz in tow, and then kind of figure out everything else around it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think when you look at it, you always have to put together the full puzzle, right? And why Diaz fits into it seamlessly, no matter the cost, is that this is a Mets team under Steve Cohen and Billy Epler that has desires to win now. We saw that go into full effect last offseason. And while the results didn't really end up the way you'd hoped for in the playoffs, the Mets won over 100 games, coming off a 77-win season. So they did transition into spending a lot of money and becoming a win-now team. Obviously, there's a hurdle they want to clear next year. They want to go deeper into the postseason. They want to make a World Series appearance and have a chance to win one. And to do that, you need somebody that can finish big ball games. It's as simple as that. So, and for the Mets window right now, they also don't have somebody in the system or even on the team that you look at and go, man, that's the future closer for the next 4 to 5 years. They don't have that guy for next year. I don't think they have that guy for 2024. You really have to reassess what your young arms look like after a couple years. So to me, Joe, that only reinforces the need of why Diaz is a must retain at all costs. And I think on the flip side, from what we've heard of Diaz, I think he's somebody that wants to be here, and that's not always the case in New York, especially for pitchers, where the pressure is hotter than ever. We've heard all the question marks around Jacob deGrom. We heard that before Bassett got here, Bassett was pretty, aware of how difficult it would be to pitch here, and he wasn't sure how much he would like it. And it worked out for Bassett, but I think Diaz is somebody that is so vocal and open to pitching in the bright lights, pitching under pressure. And I think that's a very, very important skill when you're going to be paying a closer $20 million a year.
And let's not understate the bounce back that he had from the way he started here in New York. Very often we see players come to New York, struggle out the gate, and they just lose all confidence. And especially in a spot like closer, reliever, that is pure confidence and swagger, and all that is like a huge factor. And Diaz, considering how he started, and it was at the point where I spent way too much time on Twitter having wars with people that just wanted to trade Edwin Diaz before, he ran out of value. There was people at one point in time that wanted the Mets to non-tender Edwin Diaz, which is crazy to think about now. And, his bounce back is a credit to him, his character, his mental toughness. I see no issues with Edwin Diaz as a long-term investment at record-setting money, and I like to think the Mets will think similarly. I don't think, and I know some people have talked about this, even we did, I probably at one point, was signing before free agency started. At this point, I don't see why that would be something that he would do. Even if he wants to stay, he's like a week and a half away from, or 2 weeks from, at least having other people offer him stuff. At minimum, he could use that to just squeeze a little extra money out of the Mets, and I am pro player getting as much money as they can.
And you have to think, one of the teams that could pursue him in the offseason is playing in the World Series, in the Astros. He makes sense for the Astros. Yes, they have Presley, but Montero is going to be a free agent, and we know the Astros are pedal to the metal when it comes to winning and spending, so you're right, it does make some sense for him to just hold out. And I think you have to ask yourself, if your argument is, well, what else can they do if they don't retain Diaz? To put in perspective, Joe, the relief pitching market, wins above replacement, WAR, Diaz was the leader with 5.0 in WAR. This closest guy was Craig Kimbrel, who's 34, 5 years older than Diaz, at 3, Kenley Jansen at 35 years old, 2.9, and Taylor Rogers at 2.5. Those guys are all in their mid-30s. Those guys all did not look great at times in high-leverage situations. It felt like Braves fans were sweating out every Jansen performance over summer. It felt like Rogers absolutely imploded when he got moved. So
I'm pretty sure the Dodgers didn't carry Kimbrel on their NLDS roster.
So when you look at this, I mean, it's Diaz and then no one else. And right. The Mets do have the advantage because besides the dollars advantage, Diaz has gotten comfortable here. Diaz has been vocal that he hopes the Mets come to him fast with an offer. And unlike when we had the long conversation last week about the starting pitchers, what if DeGrom wants to leave? We went through Bassett, Rodon, Verlander, all these names and then the trade market, which starting pitchers are always on the trade market each year. There is no relief situation like that this year.
Yeah, there's some interesting guys, and we're going to get into them, obviously, as we continue through the Mets' internal things that they have to deal with. But there are some guys out there that are interesting, but interesting as replacements for Adam Ottavino if he moves on, Seth Lugo, Trevor May, guys like that. That's where I think the relief market is interesting. It's not interesting when you're trying to potentially replace the best closer in baseball.
So let's transition there then. Ottavino and Lugo. We'll pair those guys together on the show because they were players that were used in high leverage roles across the innings 6 to 8 all year long. Ottavino ended up being one of the best Mets bargain signings of the year on a 1-year, $4 million contract. I'll frame it to you like this, Joe. Do you have a clear preference of who you retain? And is there somebody on the free agent market that maybe can replace these guys? God forbid you want to move on. You saw something in the advanced metrics that think, hey, Lugo's not going to be the dominant force he once was. Ottavino might have been a flash in the pan year. I don't agree with that. I'm just trying to paint the wide picture. So do you think there's somebody that can replace these guys on the free agent market, Or do you think, hey, find a way to keep them around?
Adam Ottavino feels very Aaron Loop like to me, where I
Interesting.
mean he's been good throughout his career. Loop had like a career year, but Adam Ottavino hasn't been quite this good in a couple years now. So you wonder as he's getting older if this was a bit of a flash in the pan. He's a New York guy, so he's local. He's older. Maybe you can swing a 1-year deal where he just gets a little more money than he made
6
last
mil.
year. Yeah, give him 6 mil, something like that. I'm not opposed to bringing him back. Lugo is a tough case. I look at him. The pros are great, but we saw the peaks and valleys of Seth Lugo this year, where there was times where he would come in, the fastball was 96, the curve was spinning at 3,000 RPMs, and it was just like, there's Seth Lugo. And then he'd have a couple outings where he's 92 to 93, and the curve was a little flat, and you saw him get beat up a bit. He certainly is not a guy that goes back-to-back days very often. He's had that kind of long-standing UCL deal that he's dealt with that never has required surgery, but in your head, you're automatically wondering, will something pop at some point? One thing that I would be interested to see is, are the Mets going to be willing to be aggressive in the reliever market this year, more so than years past? You mentioned a couple names that were closers this year. I don't think Kenley Jansen's taking a setup role, but Craig Kimbrel was left off an NLDS roster with the Dodgers. Is he a guy you look into and maybe consider trying to make him the setup man for a Diaz? Taylor Rogers, another example. Robert Suarez from the Padres, I believe he has a $5 million player option for this year. He was fantastic for San Diego. You saw
he's
him
got to
all
walk away
playoffs
from
long.
that.
Yeah, he'll walk away. So is this... I'm typically, typically not a big fan of buying bullpen and spending big money on the bullpen. But I wonder, depending on what happens with those other pieces, if Jacob deGrom walks out the door, you have all this kind of money to play with that you didn't before. It doesn't necessarily need to be entirely reinvested into a starting pitcher to replace him. Can you go and get a Robert Suarez for a multi-year deal that you believe he's a legitimate eighth inning guy going forward? And that way maybe you're taking less risks, because we were talking all season about the eighth inning guy as we get to the playoffs. Do we trust Ottavino? Is Lugo the guy for the eighth inning? Is Trevor May, when he comes back, the eighth inning guy? I would like it if they could build a roster that has kind of 8 and 9 locked and loaded, and then you fill in the pieces around it.
If they're going to go and spend money on a setup man type of player, and keep in mind, and we'll get to this point as well, that Trevor May's money is off the books. We talked about Ottavino and Lugo being free agents. I'll go down this road again. Andrew Chafin has a player option with the Tigers for $7 million, which at face value you look at and go, man, $7 million for a reliever. Why would they walk away from that? Because Chafin can probably get that over 2 years. $7 million a year over 2 years at minimum. He can get the same deal May got a couple years ago, plus a little more money on top of that. Chafin's been one of the best relievers in baseball consistently now for a couple years. I mean, he's had an ERA under 3 last year with the Tigers, who probably didn't do him a lot of favors. 1.83 ERA with 2 teams in 2021. So there are reliever options. Even you have to get Diaz done. That's the obvious one. But if you're worried about losing Ottavino and Lugo, and I agree with you, I think the local aspect with Ottavino is going to play big here. It was the first thing he said when he spoke to the media when he put on a Mets uniform, is that it was nice to be home for an older guy as well. But you're right. The money can be redistributed in different ways, that you can go out and get a setup man, not break the bank if you did lose both of these guys. Let's get into the middle relief kind of guys, that not necessarily players that we think could be back, but like Trevor May, for instance, right? May is somebody when at his best, and he's had a lot of health issues lately that have kept him from being his best. May did not necessarily live up to the contract he signed with the Mets, which was a 2-year, $15.5 million deal. He was solid in 2021, pitching to a 3.59 ERA and 68 appearances. Last year, the ERA over 5 and only 26 appearances. Health was a problem. Performance was a problem. Joe, you've kind of hinted at this before. I know you're intrigued by the idea of buying low on Trevor May. So I didn't want to do this pod without bringing May up and completely writing him off.
Yeah, I think if given the year he had with the health and kind of the inconsistent performance, I mean, you watch his stuff, the stuff is there. It's not like he doesn't have good stuff. He's definitely susceptible to the long ball. That's been kind of his Achilles heel for most of his career. But if kind of everything that transpired this year allows him to have to take a 1-year deal to try to kind of reset his value as a reliever, I'm not opposed to that. But if the market's a little better, or he wants to go back out west, like I know that like I'm pretty sure like he has like a Mariners thing on his wall in his streaming room. So like I don't know if he wants to be elsewhere, but I would certainly try to bring him back on a 1-year deal as more of that middle reliever. But if not, look, I'm going to give credit where it's due. Like we talk about the growing analytics team all the time, and just everything that they've done over the last 2 years, they've nailed a 1-year reliever contract.
Yep.
Aaron Loop, 1 year, $3 million, obviously pitched lights out. Adam Ottavino this year, 1 year, $4 million, like you said, was fantastic for this team. I wonder if it's you let Trevor May go knowing that he does have upside to do well elsewhere, but identify somebody on the free agent list right now. Like I have it in front of me. I can't think of it. But there's 30-something analysts in this organization now doing so. I want them to try to find this year's 1 year, $3 to $4 million replacement for Trevor May, and that person pitches to the value of $8 or $9 million.
Yeah, there's plenty of guys out there that could be intriguing in that mold. I think that there's also so many players that have club or player options that we just don't know if they're going to be a free agents yet, right? When you look at somebody that the Mets have faced plenty in recent years, you look at a player like Anthony Bass, right? Somebody that has been superb recently and kind of had that big 1 year, and you wonder, does he get to the free agent market, or does the team option get exercised on him? So that's kind of the unpredictable nature of the reliever market. Let's go back to 2 in-house guys here that are on arbitration, where they're 2 of the rare cases they're not going anywhere unless they're traded. Joely Rodriguez and Drew Smith, Joe. I think Joely had his struggles, of course, where you don't view him as somebody that's going to be put into a bigger role just because guys leave. But when Drew Smith is healthy, we've seen Drew Smith be able to get big outs for this team, and that by the nature of the bullpen, the Mets have a lot of work to do in free agency. You're not going to go buy 7 relievers. That's not how it's going to work. It kind of feels like by default, Drew Smith is going to be in line for a bigger role.
And he should. I mean, he missed a lot of time this year, obviously, with the injury kind of in the second half, but he was fantastic in the first half. I think, if we go back and listen to some of our shows from like May and June, we were probably talking about Drew Smith being the 8th inning guy.
Setup,
like,
man, no doubt.
Yeah, he was pitching that well. So Drew Smith, to me, that's the guy you put in pen. Like, I'm not a big put things in pen, but Drew Smith in pen, 2023 bullpen, he'll be there. Joely Rodriguez, that's the interesting one. So out on like the public domains, like Spotrac and those sites that like do the contracts and everything, they have Joely as arbitration eligible. I'm like 99% sure that's inaccurate.
Okay.
The way he was released and re-signed by the Yankees, I think granted him free agency after this year. So I'm almost positive Joely's just like a straight up free agent, not arbitration eligible. So in that case, I feel like I'll just find a new Joely Rodriguez. He was much better in the second half than the first half. Give him credit for that. But I could find another lefty reliever. Find this year's Aaron Loop, or I'm gonna always harp back to that because that was just such a success story for them. But just like looking at the list, I mean, it's not like an overly exciting a group of guys.
But does it ever look that way at face value?
No, almost never does. Like if you told me this time last year we were going to talk about signing Adam Ottavino, I'd be like, ew, I don't want Adam Ottavino here.
Exactly.
And he proved to be great. So I would be investigating other options for lefty relief. But credit to Joely for bouncing back, because there was a point in time where I was like, this guy might need to be designated for assignment. He's just not working here. But he'll be free, and I would not be reluctant to let him walk and find a new version of him.
Yeah, Joely's probably, if that's the case, Joely's probably going to hit free agency Drew Smith, interesting. He had a really miserable July, but got hurt. And then he came back, and in September and October combined, he only gave up 1 run the entire time. So when Drew Smith is right, he easily is one of the best relievers that the Mets have, even with all of those guys that are heading to free agency, counting them. So Drew Smith is somebody that we once again, we always plant our flag on this podcast for Drew Smith. I don't know if it's because he warms up to electric feel or something like that. Mychal Givens has a team option. Joe, I think it's safe to say that due to the nature of the price of that, I think they have to buy him out. I'm pulling it up right now. So Givens has the vested option of, it says, I think it's the $3.5 million mutual option for Givens.
Something like
his
that.
case is a little confusing, but I kind of feel like unless they're pessimistic about being able to retain anybody, that this is a player they let walk. What do you think for Givens?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mutual option. I forget what the number. If you're looking, it says $3.5 million. I'll believe that, but I do know it's a mutual option, and obviously that means both sides need to say yes. If you're the Mets, you just probably don't say yes, and you investigate the market, and you could always circle back to Mychal Givens and sign him back. You know, you let him kind of investigate the market. You see what's out there. You know, when it comes to these middle of the bullpen guys or it's funny when you think about like front end and back end, the way you use those words, like I go, oh, back end bullpen guys, like you could either take that as the Diaz guys or like the bottom of the depth chart.
I try to say front line to know it's the main dudes. Yeah.
I think
you're right though. It's very tricky.
Givens to me is lower on the depth chart, so he's a guy I don't need to commit to anything now, but come mid-December or whatever, if the market's not going the way I want, Givens, after a very, very tough beginning with the Mets, actually ended up pitching pretty solid the rest of the way. So all things considered, that was a fine trade acquisition. They didn't give up much of anything to get him, and he pitched relatively good. But, you know, it's okay to change up this bullpen. And I think you certainly look at guys like him as you can just find a different one.
All right, the last big free agent decision here has to be Trevor Williams. Somebody that made an appearance in the starters episode. He makes an appearance in the bullpen episode. Trevor Williams, Joe, I don't even know where to begin on what his market looks like. Is he one of those guys that goes out and gets paid by somebody and you're just floored? But they have belief that he can replicate what he's done with the Mets now, especially this year where he pitched to a 3.21 ERA. He made 9 starts. I mean, he pitched in plenty of games as a reliever as well, and he was wildly effective. It's crazy the year Trevor Williams had. Now, he will be 31 early in the season, so he's obviously not a guy that you see a bigger ceiling for or anything like that. But how do you weigh the Trevor Williams market here, Joe? Because what he does is essentially very hard to replace. If number one, do you think anybody on this team can replace what he does, that Swiss Army knife role? That's my biggest question for you. Or do you have to keep him around?
So Trevor Williams is a guy that obviously was fantastic for the Mets in a various amount of roles. He started doubleheaders when they needed someone to start. He stepped in when someone was out and they needed someone to start for a bit. He pitched kind of later in games. He pitched multi-inning relief roles. Trevor was a fantastic player for the Mets this year. I just don't think he's a guy that I would commit multi-years to. If he's someone that will take 1 year and a kind of reasonable salary, I'm not opposed. But if you look internally, can Tyler McGill fill a similar role?
Great call.
Could Joey Lucchesi fill a similar role? Because he's a very forgotten guy. We brought him up last week on the starters episode, but Lucchesi's a guy that has pitched out of the bullpen before. He started, so maybe he's someone at a lesser price than Trevor Williams that can be that sort of guy that give you long relief, pitch and middle relief, because he's got that funky lefty delivery. So if you need, if whoever your primary lefty is not available that day and you need to get a big lefty out, Lucchesi could potentially do that. And then obviously he can start as well. So it'll be interesting to see what his market unfolds to be. But I think the Mets do have a couple in-house options with McGill and Lucchesi that are guys that I think can take that role at a lesser financial commitment.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's a player that you love when you find them and what they do for you, and you find these unique ways to use them, but it's not something you typically go out and pay for traditionally.
Right.
You like to find that role within your system, which, kind of transitions to some guys in the system. This is one that many listening probably entirely forgot about when the news came in. The Mets signed John Kourtis last offseason. John Kourtis obviously underwent Tommy John. That was what already known when the Mets signed him. The purpose of that deal was that the Mets would have a club option for $775,000 for 2023. You could check in on his recovery. He's at your facility. You make sure he's good to go. Then you have the ultimate cost-effective option for this season. I mean, Joe, the last time Kourtis pitched a long stretch of games, yes, he struggled in a very, very few appearances in Milwaukee, but for Miami, 35 games pitched, a 2.48 ERA. He was a legitimate reliever that the Mets are paying pennies when you talk about baseball scale, and should be good to go this year.
Yeah, Kourtis was a guy that actually was like a desired trade commodity in 2021 before he had Tommy John surgery. Like you mentioned, he went from Miami to Milwaukee at the trade deadline. And, he, to me, is kind of, maybe he's your Mychal Givens replacement. Maybe you don't need to pay anybody a Mychal Givens replacement. It could just be John Kourtis, who's, a perfectly serviceable middle relief type, and a savvy move by Billy Epler to think ahead, because he talks about sustainability. He talks about long term, and part of that is knowing who's coming up to free agency. Like, we're talking about all these free agents from the bullpen. Billy Epler was thinking about that last year when he gave this deal to John Kourtis, where it's, all right, cool, we're going to be losing all these guys, and you can't pay every member of a bullpen, right? Like, we're talking about how we're going to replace these guys. Some are going to have to be some internal guys stepping up, and some obviously will get paid. But if you have a guy like Kourtis that, even if he's on the lower spectrum of your depth chart in the bullpen, he's proven capable, and he's doing it for $775,000. And given how much financial commitment the Mets are going to have to issue throughout this team this offseason, we're talking a payroll probably north of $300 million. You need at least some of those guys in there to make it work.
All right, before we try to outline a blueprint of what we would like this bullpen to look like, Joe, give me one player in the system that you think can be effective next year that either didn't really get to pitch a lot this year, like a Bryce Montes de Oca, who we saw a little bit of. Obviously, Sean Reed-Foley has gotten hurt, but he was somebody that had been effective at times. Yohan Lopez, players like that. Is there anybody that you think, because these are the guys that you have to find, these guys in a bullpen every year. You don't, like we said, you don't just go out and trade for and buy a bullpen. You go, here's our 7 guys that are going to pitch in big spots, and this is what it is. Guys get hurt, guys have to step up. Is there anybody within the system that you think can even handle a cleanup role or a sixth inning kind of role when you're losing by a lot or winning by a lot? Is there anybody like that you have faith in?
So Sean Reed-Foley had Tommy John surgery in the early part of this season. I think it was May. I forget exactly when.
Yeah.
So he's probably out for the year. It won't shock out for 2023. So it won't shock me if Sean Reed-Foley is like non-tendered or cut off the 40 entirely, because they're going to need spots. So it wouldn't shock me if he's not even a part of the organization, unless he's kind of like cut and re-signed to a minor league deal. Yohan Lopez feels like a guy that ends up getting designated for assignment in the offseason when they sign so-and-so in free agency and need a 40 spot. But you mentioned Bryce Montes de Oca, and he's the guy. That's the guy. I mean, when you think about Steven Nagosic, he's kind of the guy that'll go up and down. He has 100 lives in this organization, it seems. So he will never Steven Nagosic will never go away, and he was effective this year too.
I was going to say, this was a good Nagosic year.
But Montes de Oca is definitely the guy I'm keeping my eye on. Like, you're going to need to swing for some upside in this bullpen too. And you don't get much more upside than Montes de Oca. It comes with some questions on control, command, where things are going. The hat will come flying off. We talked about how fun he is. But when you can throw up to 101, and there's that one pitch that I actually showed a friend that isn't like an avid baseball follower the other week, talking about, like, we were talking about how hard it is to hit a baseball and stuff like that. And I'm like, how about you look at this? And it was against the Marlins. It was, I believe it was 99 miles an hour with 17 inches of horizontal run.
It's
And it's
a
just like,
wiffle ball.
yeah, the ball moves, every pitch moves so much from him. It's max effort, it's max velocity. Like, you could tell me Bryce Montes de Oca somehow ends up a setup man on the 2023 Mets, and I'd believe you. Or you could tell me, like, he's getting shuffled up and down between the minors and the majors because he can't throw strikes. So he's one to keep an eye on because the upside's so high, but he's also one of those guys that's very high upside and very low floor.
Yeah, that's very fair. A wide spectrum there. I just think the kind of stuff that he has, if he could just dial that in, even if it's not very consistent, but consistent enough to pitch in the big leagues, I'm with you that, and I've heard you talk about him for a long time, so I'm a little biased where I've had the expectations for him, and we just know what he can do. When you have that kind of stuff, you can get anyone out in any situation. You just got to make sure you know where the ball is going. So let's, a reminder everyone first. You're listening to the Mets Pod. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I want to build a blueprint of what we think this bullpen can look like before we get to the mailbag briefly here. I think you and I are in unison, as almost every Mets fan is. Edwin Diaz needs to be back, and there's just no excuse in the world to not bring Edwin Diaz back. So, Joe, can we safely in ink say that we are writing Edwin Diaz in as the top guy in this bullpen and kind of build down from there?
I don't want to have a conversation that doesn't have Edwin Diaz in ink in the bullpen. So yes, let's say the Mets will take care of what they have to and give Diaz the contract he's earned.
So let's assume you need two high leverage guys. My take is I do think one of Lugo and Ottavino will be back, and I don't think it'll be very costly. I am a little optimistic, maybe to a fault, that it'll be Ottavino because of the local roots, his age, how comfortable he was here, and the fact that I think Lugo has a better chance to get a multi-year deal, which sounds insane when you look at the years they just had. But, Joe, which way would you lean? You could also say neither, honestly, as well.
I was leaning wanting to keep one, and I was definitely leaning Ottavino. The local factor, how he pitched this year. Lugo's been great for the Mets for all his time, and, just a fantastic story. I mean, we're talking, he was drafted in 2011, same year, I believe, as Brandon Nimmo, except Lugo was a 34th round pick out of a Division II school. Like, that was back when the draft was 40 rounds long. Like, those guys almost never make the major leagues, and he's had a really strong big league career. So he's earned the right to kind of get that multi-year deal. And you kind of heard at the end of the season when they were interviewing these guys in the clubhouse, like, Lugo was talking about how, like, he wanted to take his family out on the field to take pictures because it could be, like, the last time. And so you wonder if in his head he kind of self-realizes that it could be the end of the road for him here. And, yeah, I think he'll do well somewhere else contractually. I think Ottavino is a guy that you could potentially bring back for 1 year. Then the second high-leverage guy, kind of depends how you want to approach it. The lefty market, I think, is a little weird. Not too many, like, super enticing names on the surface. So do you pay up for a Taylor Rogers, who is someone that the Mets have had interest in the past? When he was with Minnesota, they were trying to trade for him at one point. So he's someone that they have previously shown interest in, and you convince him to take kind of that eighth inning role, but also be your primary lefty. So if you need him in the seventh, you use him in the seventh against Bryce Harper or whatever the case may be. To me, I'm looking at him, and I'm looking at Robert Suarez, who's a righty. But those are the two guys I'd like to sign. Diaz and then sign one of Rogers or Suarez. Even though they're different-handed, I'm just thinking of the second high-leverage guy, and then maybe an Ottavino, where he was the number 2 guy this year. He becomes the number 3 guy in 2023.
I'm with you on that, Joe. My head is at the thought of Diaz is back, one of Ottavino and Lugo, and in this case, we are both rolling with Ottavino, and then you are paying a high-leverage guy as well. You brought up Rogers. You brought up Suarez, which is a name I really, really like and wasn't even thinking of. He probably does not take that player option and hits the market at 32 years old, tries to get more term. And then I'll throw in Andrew Chafin once again as well if you want to go back to the lefty. So those are your three. Spend a little bit of money, but you're getting a high leverage reliever to pair with Ottavino and Diaz. And now you try to round out the bullpen in a more cost-effective way. We know Drew Smith would follow up to those guys, so you write him in. There's 4 relievers that you have right there. John Kourtis would be 5. I think it's safe to write Kourtis in coming off the injury. And then when you're looking to fill at least spots 6 and 7, we can go up to 8 if you want. Lucchesi is in the mix here, most likely, right, Joe?
Yep. McGill is in the conversation. Montes de Oca is in the conversation. So
there you go. Goes quick.
While there are a lot of free agents, there is some internal stuff. It may not be all the most exciting, though I think we were optimistic about McGill's possibilities in the bullpen. I wonder if just the amount of just the arm stuff he went through. He had bicep tendonitis. He had shoulder tendonitis. Like he had a couple things that he was working through this year. Yeah, he had some nagging things. So you wonder if an off season away, maybe he's a guy that you bring to spring training with the idea of you're a reliever now. But conversely, I guess the counterpoint is there's no starting depth here. So does he need to be a starter? And, maybe that means he opens in AAA Syracuse. So there's some options there with McGill. Lucchesi, I think, he fits the mold of what you had in Trevor Williams and at a probably lesser cost. And then Montes de Oca, obviously, we talked about him. At that point, you have essentially a full bullpen on paper pretty quickly. And then, if there's anything else in free agency you can investigate, like always sign relievers to minor league deals that have some upside and just see what happens in spring training. But you don't have to do it doesn't feel like you have to do the same kind of gymnastics that you have to do in the rotation as the in the bullpen as the rotation.
All right, let's get into the mailbag. That was easier than I expected. When I looked at it, I was like, man, they have a lot of spots to fill. This is going to look real ugly at the end of the day. It helps when you could factor in some money into it. I mean, we went out and not only paid Edwin Diaz a record-setting contract, but then also paid for a high-leverage setup man and retained Adam Ottavino. So maybe we are being hopeful, but hey, if you can't be hopeful in this era of Mets baseball in the offseason, I don't know what to tell you. Let's get into the mailbag here. This one, first question from Krauk. Who asked, where do you guys realistically expect David Peterson to start 2023? MLB rotation, MLB bullpen, Syracuse. Cheers. Wayne in the UK. I read his Twitter name, but that is from Wayne. All right. Joe, I said it in the starter show. If David Peterson isn't in the rotation now, I don't know when we will see David Peterson locked into the rotation. I don't know what he needs to do at that point.
Can I just say I'm excited? The Mets pod is international, so we have. Yes. I love it. So
pretty awesome. Thank you, Wayne.
Yeah, much appreciated. But to me, I think Peterson should be kind of penciled in as that fifth starter. He certainly has the flexibility to pitch in the bullpen. We saw that down the stretch. He did a really good job. But given what's happening in the rotation with the uncertainty around DeGrom and Bassett, what do they do with Carrasco? We think they should pick up the option, but it's certainly not a lock that they do. And Taijuan Walker's a free agent with very little coming from the minor leagues. So to me, like you said, if David Peterson is not able to crack this rotation now, he might just never be able to. So I'd look at him as a cost-effective fifth starter.
No doubt. And that's not even factoring in that you're going to lose arms at some point of the season. 6, 7, and 8 matters a lot. We always talk 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6, 7, and 8, especially in Mets land, always matters so much. So that'll be another thing to keep an eye on relating to the bullpen is the guys that can convert, like Lucchesi in the spot, like McGill, which his future's up in the air as well, exactly what he'll be. All right, one more here in the mailbag because honestly, we answered every other question at this point on the show already. So this is definitely a question for you, Joe. Return of the Mac asked, is Matt Allan still alive? What about Ziegler? And how did Butto look after being sent back down? The Mets need an influx of young, cost-effective arms if they're going to be able to do this thing.
So I'll take them one by one. So Matt Allan,
yes.
confirmed alive. I can confirm he is alive. As far as pitching goes, I would expect he will be full go for spring training. He obviously had the follow-up nerve transposition surgery after Tommy John, which isn't wildly uncommon. Jacob deGrom had it. He just didn't have it immediately after. So deGrom had Tommy John, then had nerve transposition a few years later. Steven Matz had it pretty quickly after Tommy John. So it's not uncommon. It's just a little less common to have him kind of back-to-back and wipe out 2 years. So I love Matt Allan, the talent. He's going to, by proxy of not pitching, fall down my prospect rankings when I update them this winter. The reality is he got drafted in 2019 and he has 10 professional innings. Part of that is injury. Part of that is the COVID season being wiped out. But from what I hear, you should expect Matt Allan to be ready to go in spring training. And then we'll see kind of exactly what he's all about. Who was the second name?
Ziegler and then Butto.
Okay. Ziegler, he dealt with some health stuff this year. Kind of, though, was exactly what he was as a draft prospect. And he's going to need some further development. But, it's high velocity up to 97. The breaking ball, extreme swing and miss pitch. He's developed a splitter, which has been effective, but he still needs work on throwing strikes. So you wonder from a long-term standpoint if he's more of a starter or a reliever type of profile, but he's still so young. He has time to figure out the control, and you can't teach that type of stuff. And when you talk swing and miss rate, it was amongst the best in the Florida State League this year. So an exciting prospect that certainly belongs within the top 10 or so of this system. While the system's improving, Ziegler's still up there. And Jose Butto, we talked about him a little bit last week, but he went back to Syracuse. He had an ERA just over 1 for the remainder of the season after getting sent down from his kind of rushed up start against the Phillies that didn't go so well. He's going to be a prime piece of rotation depth in 2023 because they're going to fill out a rotation, obviously, with big leaguers. But like you said just a couple minutes ago, 6, 7, 8, 9, those guys are going to matter. And Jose Butto is, I think, naturally going to transition to be one of those top 8, 9 guys for starting depth.
No doubt. I mean, Ziegler's still 20 years old.
Yeah,
so
he's a kid.
He's really far away. Matt Allan, still 21, which is crazy. It feels like he's been with the Mets forever. So plenty of time for him to get right and become the... Joe, and Matt Allan was drafted, there were expectations that he's a future mid-rotation starter. With a ceiling higher.
Yeah, maybe even better. Like back then, on my draft board in the 2019 draft, I had Matt Allan ranked ahead of Brett Beatty. And,
there you go.
And obviously, Allan hasn't pitched much at all. But to his credit, when he did in 2019, as a high school kid, he was thrust into the Brooklyn bullpen for their playoff run towards a championship. So playing against, at that time, Brooklyn was basically just all college seniors and guys like that. So he was facing an older competition and he held his own. So the stuff is there, the talent is there. He just hasn't pitched in so long. But you mentioned his age at 21, is assuming everything goes good in spring training and he starts, let's call it with St. Lucie. He's basically taking the track of like a college junior at this point. So he's not too far behind regular development, I guess you'd say. But obviously it's just a huge question mark what he is going to be.
All right, a reminder to everyone, we will be with you every week throughout the offseason. Next week, we'll dive into all of the questions and next steps regarding the lineup and the bench, which is going to be a much different show than these first two. With these shows, starting pitching and bullpen, there are so many questions of players that have been on the Mets that are heading to free agency. It's more of who do you keep? You're going to have to make hard decisions to let guys walk. With the lineup, we know that's not going to be the case, Joe, outside of Brandon Nimmo. We're going to be talking about what additions can you make to get this lineup over the top and how creative can you get with this lineup. So that's going to be a really fun show. But, Joe, closing thoughts on episode 2 of our offseason series here covering the bullpen. We've
hit the 2 hard ones, right?
Absolutely.
2 hard ones.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they're behind us, and yeah, excited to talk about the lineup next week. And just stay tuned. Like Connor said, we're going to be here every week throughout the whole off season. We're going to hit all the rumors, all the signings, trades, everything that they actually do. We're not going anywhere. So
Ohtani, Judge, we have it all covered here.
future Mets, Shohei Ohtani and Aaron Judge. You never know. Nothing's off the table with the Mets.
It's going to be awesome. So thank you so much, everybody. Reminder, subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. We'll catch you next week.